They stopped speaking to him the morning after he saved her life, and Ethan Cole couldn't shake the feeling that the silence had weight, like it was pressing down on every wooden wall and dusty street in Red Hollow. The kind of silence that doesn't belong in a town that usually wakes with the sound of boots on porch boards and coffee mugs clinking against tin. It started before the sun even cleared the ridge, when the wind should have been the only thing moving. But even that felt like it held back, like the land itself was waiting for something to be said that no one wanted to say. And Ethan stood by his stall, brushing down his horse in slow, steady strokes, trying to ignore the memory of cold river water still clinging to his bones from the night before, trying to tell himself it had been nothing more than a simple act, a man seeing someone in trouble and stepping in, the way his father had taught him back when the world still made sense, before long stretches of empty land and longer stretches of silence taught him otherwise. He could still see her face when he closed his eyes, pale against the rushing current, dark hair plastered to her cheeks, eyes wide but not wild, not panicked like most would be. No, there was something else in them, something steady, something that looked like recognition, and that was the part that didn't sit right, because he had never seen her before, not in Red Hollow, not on the trails, not anywhere within 50 miles of dust and fence line. And yet when he pulled her from the river, when his hands gripped the soaked fabric of her dress, and he dragged her through the current inch by inch, she looked at him like she already knew what would follow, like she wasn't afraid of the water but of what came after, and that kind of look stays with a man longer than the cold ever could. He finished saddling up and rode into town just as the sun broke over the hills, casting long shadows across the main street, and that's when he felt it. Not heard it, not at first, felt it. The absence of sound, no greetings, no nods, no lazy ways from men leaning against posts, just eyes that flickered toward him and then away too fast, doors that creaked shut before he got close, and boots that changed direction without explanation. He slowed his horse near the general store, expecting old Mr. Harlan to call out about the weather like he always did, but the man stood in the doorway with his hands folded, staring straight ahead like Ethan wasn't even there. And when Ethan tipped his hat, the gesture hanging in the air between them, Harlan didn't return it, didn't move, didn't speak, and that's when the silence stopped feeling like coincidence and started feeling like choice, like everyone in this town had agreed on something without him. And whatever it was, it had his name tied to it. He dismounted, boots hitting the dirt with a dull thud that sounded too loud in the stillness, and walked toward the water trough where a couple of ranch hands usually stood trading stories. But today they stepped aside before he reached them, not in anger, not in fear, but in something harder to read. Something like avoidance, like they didn't trust themselves to say the wrong thing. And Ethan felt that same cold from the river creep back up his spine, because men don't go quiet for no reason out here, not unless there's something bigger than words standing behind it, something that makes speaking feel dangerous, or worse, makes silence feel like the only honest thing left. And as he looked down the length of the street, past the saloon doors that stayed shut and the windows that reflected nothing but his own still figure, he realized the town wasn't empty. Not really. It was watching, holding its breath, waiting, and he had no idea what for. Only that it had something to do with a girl who never said a word and a river that didn't keep her like it was supposed to. The longer Ethan stood in that silence, the more it began to feel like a message he was expected to understand without anyone explaining it. And that was the part that bothered him most. Not the quiet itself, but the way it wrapped around him like something intentional, something decided before he ever rode into town. He moved past the trough and toward the saloon, boots steady, shoulders squared, because if there was one place that never stayed quiet, it was that room with its swinging doors and worn wooden floors. But when he pushed those doors open, even the echo felt wrong. A handful of men sat at tables with their hats low, cards untouched in their hands, glasses resting full on the wood, and not a single voice filled the air, not even a whisper. They all looked up at the same time, and just as quickly, they looked away. One man stood and walked out without finishing his drink. Another folded his cards and slid them into his pocket like the game had never mattered. And Ethan felt something tighten in his chest. Not anger, not yet, but something close to it, something that came from being shut out without reason. He stepped up to the bar where the bartender usually greeted him by name. But today the man wiped the same spot over and over, eyes fixed on the counter, hands moving like he had forgotten how to stop. "Coffee," Ethan said, voice cutting through the stillness sharper than he intended. The bartender paused for just a second, then poured without a word, setting the cup down with care, but never meeting his eyes. And that was when Ethan leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "You all planning on pretending I do not exist? Or is there something you want to say?" The bartender's hand froze on the cloth, just for a moment, then resumed its motion, slow and deliberate, like the answer was already chosen. And the lack of response hit harder than any insult could have, because out here, words mattered. Even harsh ones. Silence was something else entirely. It was distance. It was judgment without explanation. Ethan picked up the cup, the warmth grounding him for a second, but it did nothing to ease the unease building under his ribs. He turned and walked back out into the sunlight, the brightness almost too sharp after the dim room. And the street had not changed. People moved, but not around him, always away, always just enough to avoid standing close, like there was an invisible line drawn in the dirt and he had stepped across it without knowing. He caught sight of Sheriff Dalton near the jailhouse, leaning against the post with his arms crossed, a man who had never been short on words, a man who usually carried conversations like they were part of his duty, and if anyone would break this silence, it would be him. Ethan walked straight toward him, each step steady, measured, and when he stopped a few feet away, Dalton looked up, eyes meeting his for a fraction of a second before drifting past him like something behind Ethan held more interest. "Morning," Ethan said, simple, direct, giving the man an easy way in. Dalton shifted his weight, jaw tightening slightly, then nodded once, barely, but said nothing. And that was when Ethan felt the first real edge of something sharper than confusion, because this was not avoidance anymore. This was choice, repeated, deliberate, shared. "You going to tell me what is going on?" Ethan asked, his voice lower now, not raised, but carrying weight. Dalton's gaze flickered again, this time holding just long enough for Ethan to see it. Not anger, not fear, but something closer to regret, and then it was gone, replaced by that same empty distance. "Nothing to say," Dalton replied finally, the words quiet, measured, and they landed heavier than if he had shouted them, because they were not true, not even close. Ethan studied him for a second longer, searching for something real in the man's face, but all he found was that same wall everyone else seemed to be hiding behind, and that was when he heard it, not loud, not clear, just enough to carry across the dry air, a voice from somewhere down the street, old, worn, and unsteady. "You should not have touched her." Ethan turned slightly, eyes narrowing, trying to find who had spoken, but no one stepped forward, no one claimed the words, and they hung there, thin as dust in the sunlight, and something about them settled into place in his mind, not fully, not yet, but enough to make the silence feel different, not random, not meaningless, but tied to that moment by the river, tied to the girl who had not spoken a single word, and for the first time since dawn. Ethan felt something colder than confusion, because if helping her was the reason for all this, then whatever story this town believed was not the one he lived through, and somewhere between the river and this empty street, the truth had been twisted into something he had not yet seen. The words lingered longer than they should have, thin and brittle in the air, and Ethan felt them settle somewhere deep, not as an answer, but as a question he had not known to ask. He turned slowly, scanning the faces along the street, looking for the man who had spoken, but every pair of eyes avoided his, every posture stiffened just enough to deny it, like the whole town had agreed to carry the same secret, and no one wanted to be the one who dropped it first. Ethan exhaled through his nose, slow and controlled, the way he had learned to do when things did not add up, when the truth was close but just out of reach, and he stepped away from the center of town without another word, because whatever was happening here was not going to be handed to him, not in daylight, not with witnesses. He mounted his horse and turned toward the outskirts, where the buildings thinned and the land stretched back into open dust and scrub, where the river cut its quiet path through rock and memory, the same river that had nearly taken that girl the night before, the same river that now seemed tied to whatever silence had taken hold of Red Hollow. The ride out was short, but felt longer, the air heavier with each step, and when he reached the bend where the current ran strongest, he slowed, eyes tracing the line of water where it had churned and pulled. Where he had first seen her, there were still marks in the mud. Along the bank, faint, already fading under the morning sun, his own boot prints, the drag of movement, and something smaller, lighter, the path she had taken when she stepped away from him. He dismounted and crouched near the edge, running his fingers lightly over the ground as if the dirt might still hold some answer. But it gave him nothing, just dust and the quiet sound of water moving past. He stood again, scanning the tree line where she had disappeared, and for a moment he considered following, pushing deeper into land that did not belong to him. But something held him back, not fear, not hesitation, something closer to respect, like stepping past that line without understanding it would only make things worse. He turned back toward the river instead, replaying the moment in his mind. Every detail, every second, the way she had not cried out, the way her eyes had stayed fixed on him even as the current fought against them, the way her hand had pressed against his chest once they reached the bank, not in gratitude, not exactly, but in recognition. And that was when it struck him, sharp and sudden, the difference between what he had done and what the town believed he had done, because the man's words echoed again. You should not have touched her, not helped her, not saved her, touched her. And Ethan straightened slowly, the pieces shifting into a shape he did not like, not one bit. Out here, among these people, lines were drawn without being spoken, lines about land, about blood, about who belonged and who did not. And crossing those lines, even by accident, had a way of turning a simple act into something else entirely, something that carried meaning he never intended. He looked back toward the distant outline of Red Hollow, small against the horizon, and for the first time, the silence there made a different kind of sense, not acceptance, not agreement, but fear of saying the wrong thing about something they already believed, something they had decided the moment they heard what happened by the river, or worse, the moment they saw it with their own eyes. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly as he considered that, because if anyone had been watching from a distance, if they had seen him pulling her from the water, seen the torn fabric, seen her step back in fear, then what they thought they saw and what actually happened would not be the same thing at all. And out here, what people believe carried more weight than the truth itself. He walked a few steps along the bank, boots pressing into the damp ground, following the faint line where her path had led into the trees, and though the marks were nearly gone, he could still see the direction, still feel the pull of it, like the answer to everything waiting just beyond that line of shadow. He stopped again, eyes narrowing slightly, because there was one thing he had not noticed before, something small, something easy to miss, caught between two stones near the water's edge, a piece of fabric, no larger than his palm, darkened by the river, but still holding a hint of color beneath the wet. He bent down and picked it up carefully, turning it in his hand, the edge torn clean, the threads pulled apart in a way that matched the moment he had dragged her from the current, and for a second, the weight of it felt heavier than it should have, like it carried more than cloth ever could, like it was the kind of thing someone else might see and decide a story from, a story he had no say in. Ethan closed his hand around it slowly, the silence of the river pressing in around him again, and he realized that whatever had begun here the night before had not ended when he walked away. It had followed him back, grown into something larger, something that now stood between him and every person in that town. And somewhere ahead, beyond the trees where she had gone, was the truth that could either break that silence or make it permanent. The piece of fabric stayed in his hand longer than it should have, damp and light, yet carrying a weight that did not belong to cloth. And Ethan stood there at the edge of the river with the sound of water moving steady and indifferent beside him, trying to understand how something so small could be enough to turn an entire town against him. He turned it over once more between his fingers, noticing the faint stitching along the edge. Careful work. Not something thrown together, something made with purpose. And that thought settled deeper than he liked, because it meant the girl was not just passing through, not just lost. She belonged somewhere, to someone. And out here, belonging meant lines, and those lines were not meant to be crossed, not even by accident. He slipped the fabric into his pocket slowly, like it might matter later, like it might be the only piece of truth he had left that had not been twisted by other eyes. Then he looked toward the trees again, the place where she had disappeared, and this time he did not hesitate, not fully, but enough to step forward, just a few paces into the shade where the sunlight broke into thin lines across the ground. The air cooler there, quieter in a different way, not empty like the town, but watchful, like the land itself was aware of him now, aware that he had crossed a line he did not understand. He followed the faint trail as far as he could, boots moving slow, careful not to disturb what little remained. But the ground turned hard too quickly, the signs fading into nothing, and after a dozen steps more, there was no path left to follow, only trees and stillness. And Ethan stopped, listening, waiting for something, anything. But all he heard was the distant river and the soft shift of wind through leaves. No movement, no voice. Not even a sign that she had ever been there beyond what he already held in his pocket. He exhaled and stepped back out into the sunlight, because pushing further would not give him answers. Not yet. And something told him the answers were not hidden out here anyway. They were back in town, buried behind closed mouths and lowered eyes. He mounted his horse again and turned back toward Red Hollow. The ride shorter this time, more direct, his mind working through what little he had. The silence, the warning, the way people looked at him like he had done something he could not name. And when the buildings came back into view, nothing had changed on the surface. Same dusty street, same wooden fronts, same people moving without speaking. But now Ethan saw it differently. Now he noticed the way groups stood just far enough apart to keep their voices low, the way glances passed between them like messages, the way no one stood alone unless they had to. Like being alone meant being the one who might break first. He dismounted near the edge of town and tied his horse loosely, choosing to walk the rest of the way, slower, more deliberate, giving himself time to watch, to listen. And that was when he saw her, not the girl from the river, but someone else. A woman standing near the well, older, her face lined from years under the same sun, her hands resting on the handle like she had forgotten what she came there to do. And she was looking at him, not turning away like the others, not hiding, just watching. And there was something in her eyes that felt different, not avoidance, not judgment, something closer to conflict, like she was standing on the edge of a decision she had not yet made. Ethan slowed as he approached, not speaking at first, giving her the space to turn away if she wanted to. But she did not. She stayed there, meeting his gaze, and when he stopped a few feet away, the silence between them felt sharper than anywhere else in town. "You going to tell me what I did?" he asked, voice low, steady. And for a moment she said nothing, her grip tightening slightly on the well handle, her eyes flicking once toward the others nearby before returning to him. And when she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, almost careful. "It is not what you did," she said, the words measured, like each one had to be chosen. "It is what they think you did." Ethan held her gaze, letting that settle, because it confirmed what he already suspected, but did not explain it. Not enough. "And what do they think?" he asked, and the woman hesitated, her eyes shifting again, this time longer, like she was weighing something heavier than fear. And when she looked back at him, there was something like regret in her expression, something that made the next words land harder than anything else he had heard that morning. "They think you crossed a line that should never be crossed," she said. And then she looked down, breaking the connection, as if even saying that much was more than she should have. And Ethan stood there with that answer, incomplete but clearer than anything else, because now he knew this was not about the river, not about the rescue. It was about something older, something already rooted in this town long before he stepped into that water, something that had been waiting for a moment like that to surface. And as he turned slightly, glancing down the street where the silence still held firm, he realized that whatever line they believed he had crossed, it was not drawn in the dirt or along the riverbank. It was drawn in their minds, and once crossed, it did not matter what the truth looked like, only what they chose to see. And somewhere beyond that silence, the girl who never spoke carried the other side of that story. The part no one here was willing to face. The woman's words did not fade when Ethan walked away. They followed him, settled into the rhythm of his steps, into the slow beat of his thoughts, because now the silence had a shape, not just absence, but something built on belief, something that had been waiting for a moment like this to rise to the surface. And Ethan moved down the street with that weight sitting just behind his eyes, watching more carefully now, seeing what he had missed before. The way conversations stopped before they began, the way hands tightened on reins, the way no one stood too close to him for longer than a second. Like proximity itself carried risk, and that was when he noticed something else, something quieter than the silence, but just as telling. No one spoke her name. Not even in whispers, not even in passing. Like the girl from the river did not exist in their world except as an idea, a story already decided, and that thought settled hard in his chest, because it meant they had filled in the blanks on their own, had taken what little they knew and shaped it into something that fit the lines they believed in. Ethan stopped near the edge of the street where the buildings gave way to open land again. And for a moment he just stood there, looking out at the horizon, letting the wind move past him, steady and dry, carrying dust across the ground in thin drifting lines. And he reached into his pocket, pulling out the piece of fabric once more, holding it up slightly in the light, studying it again. Because if the town had built a story from what they thought they saw, then this small torn edge, was the only piece of what actually happened that he still had. And he turned it slowly, noticing the fine thread work, the faint pattern that ran through it, something deliberate, something that belonged to a larger whole. And that was when a quiet thought pressed forward, one that had been sitting just beneath everything else. If she belonged to something larger, then her disappearance into the trees had not been an ending. It had been a return, and that meant someone else would know, someone beyond this town silence, someone who did not rely on guesses or distance to decide what had happened. Ethan closed his hand around the fabric again and slipped it back into his pocket, the motion small but certain, because standing here waiting for the town to speak was not going to change anything, not when they had already chosen not to. He turned back toward his horse, untied the reins, and mounted with a smooth motion, the leather creaking softly under his weight. And for a second he hesitated, looking once more at the quiet street behind him, at the people who would not meet his eyes, at the place that had felt simple just a day before and now felt layered with something older than he had ever paid attention to. Then he turned the horse toward the river again. But this time he did not stop at the bank. He followed the line of water further downstream, letting the current guide his path. Because if she had come from somewhere, if she had been near that river before he found her, then there might be signs further along, something the town had not seen, something they had not turned into a story yet. The ride was quiet except for the steady rhythm of hooves against packed earth, and the further he went, the more the land changed, the open stretch narrowing slightly, the trees thickening in places where the river curved. And after a mile or so, he began to notice it, small things at first, easy to miss if you were not looking for them. A broken branch that did not match the wind's direction, a footprint near the water that had not fully dried, lighter than his own, smaller, leading away from the bank and then back again. And Ethan slowed, guiding the horse carefully, his eyes scanning the ground with more focus now, because this was different. This was not guesswork. This was something real, something left behind. And when he reached a bend where the river widened slightly, he saw it. Not movement, not a person, but something placed with intention, a small object, resting on a flat stone near the edge of the water, simple but unmistakable once you saw it. A beaded piece, woven tight with colors that stood out even in the dust and light. And Ethan dismounted slowly, approaching it with a kind of quiet respect he could not fully explain, because something about it felt like more than an object, like it carried meaning beyond its size. He crouched and picked it up gently, turning it in his hand, and as he did, the connection formed, not sudden, not loud, but steady and clear. This belonged to her, or to someone close to her, and it had not been dropped, it had been left. And that realization shifted something inside him, because leaving something behind meant intention, meant a message. And Ethan straightened slowly, eyes lifting toward the tree line beyond the river's edge, because now he knew one thing for certain. Whatever truth the town refused to speak, it had not ended at that silence. It had moved forward, waiting somewhere ahead. And this time, it was not hiding the farther Ethan rode from the river, the heavier the air around him seemed to become. Not because anything had changed in the land itself, but because the shape of what he was beginning to understand no longer fit inside anything simple. And the small beaded object in his pocket felt less like evidence and more like a direction, as if it was not something he had found, but something that had been left for him to follow. The trail along the water had narrowed into a rougher stretch of land where the trees leaned closer together, their branches forming uneven shadows across the ground. And the sound of the river softened into something distant, almost hidden, like it was trying not to be heard. Ethan slowed his horse as the path became less certain, scanning the ground for anything that might confirm what he already suspected, and after a few minutes he found it. Another faint mark near the edge of the brush, a disturbed patch of soil, not fresh enough to be recent, but not old enough to be meaningless, as if someone had passed through carefully, deliberately avoiding attention. He dismounted and moved forward on foot, leading the horse slowly behind him. The animal's breathing steady but alert, reacting to the same stillness that seemed to settle deeper the farther he went, and the forest ahead did not feel empty. It felt watched in a way that could not be explained by sight alone. Ethan stopped near a cluster of trees where the light broke unevenly through the leaves, and for a moment he simply listened, the wind moving lightly through branches, the distant river shifting its tone as it curved away, and beneath all of it, something else, not a sound exactly, but a sense of presence, like the space itself was holding back information it refused to give. He stepped forward again, carefully now, and noticed another object half buried near the base of a tree, smaller than the first, tied with a thin strip of worn material. And when he picked it up, he saw the same pattern of careful work, the same intentional design, and that confirmed what he had begun to suspect back at the river. This was not random. This was a trail, not of escape, but of communication. Ethan looked up toward the thicker part of the woods, where the trees grew closer together and the light thinned into a dim green haze, and he felt something shift in his understanding of everything that had happened since the river, because silence in a town could be misunderstanding, but silence in the land felt like agreement, like everything here was connected in a way he was only beginning to see. He moved forward again, slower now, following the subtle signs, each one more intentional than the last, and the deeper he went, the more the world around him changed, not in appearance, but in feeling, as if he had crossed an invisible boundary without realizing it, leaving behind the logic of the town and entering something older, something governed by rules he had never been taught. And after another stretch of careful movement, he saw movement ahead, not sudden, not threatening, just a shift in the air between trees, a pause in the way light fell through branches, and Ethan stopped immediately, holding still, his hand resting lightly near the reins. And then he saw her, not close enough to speak, but close enough to recognize, standing between two trees as if she had been there long before he arrived. The same girl from the river, no longer in wet clothing, no longer trembling, but still silent, still unreadable, her gaze fixed on him with the same steady awareness he remembered, and for a long moment neither of them moved, the forest holding everything between them in perfect stillness. Ethan did not step forward, and she did not retreat. Instead, she simply lifted her hand slightly, not in greeting, not in warning, but in recognition, as if confirming that he had followed correctly, that he had arrived where he was meant to be. And then, just as quietly as she had appeared, she turned and began to walk deeper into the trees, not looking back, not rushing, leaving no sound behind her. And Ethan understood in that moment that this was not an encounter, it was an invitation, and if he followed, he would not be returning to anything he had known before. The deeper Ethan followed her into the trees, the more the world behind him seemed to fade, not in disappearance but in importance, as if the farther he went, the less the town mattered, and the more the land itself began to take over the meaning of things. The girl moved ahead of him, without turning, her steps quiet and deliberate, never breaking pace, never hesitating, and Ethan kept a steady distance behind her, not because he was afraid to get closer, but because something about the way she led felt like a rule he had not yet been told. The forest around them thickened in layers, sunlight breaking through only in thin, scattered lines that shifted with the wind, and every few steps Ethan noticed more signs, subtle but intentional, markings that were not random, not natural, but placed, like someone had been guiding a path for those who knew how to read it. And that thought changed the way he moved, slower now, more aware of every sound his boots made against the ground, the horse following quietly behind him as if it understood the need for silence. After several minutes, the terrain began to rise slightly, the trees growing older and wider, their trunks marked with faint symbols carved long ago. Worn down by time, but still visible enough to suggest meaning. Ethan reached out once to touch one of them, then stopped, deciding instead to simply observe, because whatever this place was, it was not meant to be entered casually. It was meant to be approached with understanding. The girl finally slowed near a break in the trees where the forest opened into a wide clearing, and she stopped at the edge, not stepping fully into it. Waiting, Ethan came up behind her but kept his distance, letting his eyes adjust, and what he saw made him pause completely. The clearing was not empty. It held structure, not buildings in the way a town would have them, but arrangements of space, paths that intersected with purpose, low structures made of wood and stone that blended into the land rather than standing against it, and people scattered across the area, not rushing, not reacting, but watching, as if they had been expecting this moment to arrive. Ethan dismounted slowly, his movements careful, controlled, and the girl finally turned her head slightly toward him, not speaking, but giving a small motion of her hand, subtle but clear enough to understand as permission to step forward. He did not rush. He walked instead into the clearing with measured steps, aware of every pair of eyes that followed him. And as he moved deeper inside, he noticed something else. There was no tension here, no fear, only attention, like his arrival was being observed rather than judged, and that distinction mattered more than he expected, because it meant he was not entering a place of hostility, but a place of awareness. He stopped near the center where the ground flattened into packed earth, and there he saw them more clearly, individuals standing in quiet formation, their expressions calm, steady, not aggressive, but grounded in something firm, something built from shared understanding. And then he saw a movement near the far side of the clearing, a figure stepping forward from a larger structure, older, deliberate, carrying the kind of presence that did not need urgency to command attention. The girl from the river moved slightly closer to that figure, and Ethan realized in that moment that she had not brought him here by accident. He had been expected. The older figure stopped a short distance away and looked at Ethan for a long moment without speaking. And in that silence, Ethan felt the weight of everything shift again, not toward danger, but toward recognition, like he had crossed from one version of reality into another. And what happened next would determine not only what the town believed about him, but what truth this place was willing to reveal. The silence inside the clearing was not empty. It was structured, like something carefully maintained over time, and Ethan stood at its edge with the same feeling he had carried since leaving the river, that every step forward had already been accounted for by someone else. The older figure, who had stepped forward earlier, now remained still, watching him with a calm that carried no urgency, no hostility, only certainty. And Ethan felt the weight of that attention settle over him like a question he had not yet learned how to answer. The girl from the river stood slightly behind and to the side of that figure, her presence quieter now, but no less deliberate. And for the first time, Ethan noticed that she was not simply part of this place. She belonged to it in a way that required no explanation. The older figure finally raised a hand slightly, not in greeting but in acknowledgement, and then spoke, the voice steady and measured, carrying across the clearing without effort. Ethan Cole. The words were simple, but hearing his name spoken here made something shift inside him, because it confirmed that this was not discovery, it was recognition, and that meant his arrival had been anticipated. Ethan did not respond immediately. Instead, he held his ground, letting the silence between them stretch, because anything he said would be weighed against something he could not see, and that imbalance mattered. After a moment, he spoke carefully. "I am not here to cause trouble." The older figure studied him for a long time before replying. "Trouble is not what follows you. It is what follows misunderstanding." And as those words settled, Ethan felt the meaning behind them pressing in closer than anything else had so far. The girl from the river stepped forward then, just enough to be seen clearly, and for the first time she spoke, not with sound, but with motion, her hands moving in a slow, deliberate pattern that Ethan did not understand, but which caused a subtle shift in those watching, like the meaning was shared without translation. And Ethan realized then that language here was not limited to words. It was carried in gesture, in presence, in memory. The older figure turned slightly toward him and gestured for him to step further into the clearing. And after a brief pause, Ethan did, moving slowly, aware that every step he took was being measured not for threat, but for intent. As he reached the center, he saw more details he had missed before. The arrangement of space was not random. It formed pathways that directed movement without force, and gatherings that allowed observation without confrontation. It was structured but not controlled, and that distinction mattered. The older figure began to walk slowly around him at a distance, studying him in silence for several moments before speaking again. What you did at the river was seen. Ethan held steady. I saved her, he said simply. And for a moment there was no response, only the sound of wind moving through the edges of the clearing. Then the older figure stopped and nodded once. That is also what was seen. The difference between what is done and what is understood is where conflict begins. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, because he was beginning to realize that this was not about defense or accusation. It was about interpretation. The girl from the river moved closer to the older figure again, and then turned slightly toward Ethan. And this time he noticed something new, the way others in the clearing were watching her, not with concern, but with respect, as if her presence carried weight beyond her silence. The older figure spoke again. The river does not keep what it takes, it only carries it, and those who live by its edges decide what story it tells afterward. Ethan looked at him directly now. Then what story are they telling? The older figure paused, and for the first time his expression changed slightly, not into emotion, but into gravity. The story they tell depends on which side of the river they choose to stand on. And Ethan felt the meaning of that settle in deeper than anything before it, because it meant the silence in Red Hollow was not confusion, it was alignment, and the river was not the source of the problem. It was only where the truth had begun to surface. The girl from the river stood still now, watching him, and Ethan understood that whatever came next would not be about explaining what had happened. It would be about deciding whether the truth itself would be allowed to exist at all. The air inside the clearing felt different now. Not heavier, not lighter, but clearer, as if the truth Ethan had been chasing was no longer hidden in fragments along a river, or in silent streets, but standing directly in front of him, waiting for him to understand it fully. The older figure remained still after speaking, his presence steady like the land itself, and around them the people of this place did not move with tension or fear, but with a kind of settled awareness, as though nothing here required urgency, because everything had already been understood long before Ethan arrived. The girl from the river stood slightly apart now, her eyes fixed on him with the same quiet intensity he remembered, but there was no fear in her expression, no uncertainty, only a calm that seemed to confirm she had never been lost, only displaced from a story that did not belong to her. Ethan exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of every assumption he had carried from Red Hollow begin to break apart, because nothing here matched what the town had made him believe, not the silence, not the distance, not the way people had looked away from him. The older figure spoke again, his voice steady. Ethan Cole, what you carried her from was not danger, it was misunderstanding, and misunderstanding has always traveled faster than truth. Ethan looked down for a moment, the words settling in deeper than he expected, because they explained everything without accusing him of anything. The silence in town, the shifting eyes, the unwillingness to speak. It was not rejection of him. It was fear of being wrong about what they thought they had seen. He finally asked quietly, then, why does no one speak of her? The girl from the river stepped forward slightly, and for the first time her hands moved with purpose again, forming shapes in the air between them. And this time Ethan noticed something subtle, the way others in the clearing watched her hands with understanding, not confusion, and slowly it began to make sense. Communication here was not limited to voice. It was shared through memory, through agreement, through what was allowed to be acknowledged. The older figure answered, because speaking requires ownership, and what happened by the river belongs to more than one history. Ethan felt that answer settle into something deeper, because it meant silence was not absence, it was protection, not of a lie, but of something too fragile to be handled incorrectly. The girl from the river met his eyes directly now, and Ethan realized she had never been silent in the way he had assumed. She had simply been communicating in a language the town refused to understand, or refused to learn. The older figure turned slightly toward the edge of the clearing, where the forest opened back toward the direction Ethan had come, and spoke again. What you do with what you know now will decide which side of that river you remain on. Ethan followed his gaze, thinking of Red Hollow, of the people who had turned away without explanation, of the weight of a story that had already been written without him. And for the first time, he understood that returning would not be about defending himself. It would be about deciding whether truth had a place in a place that had already chosen silence. He looked back at the girl, and she gave a small motion of her hand, not a command, not a request, but a simple acknowledgement, as if whatever choice he made would not change what she already understood about him. Ethan stood there for a long moment, the forest quiet around him, not waiting, not pushing, simply existing. And in that stillness, he realized something that shifted everything he had believed since the river. He had not been drawn into a conflict between two sides. He had been drawn into the space between them, where truth was not spoken loudly, but carried carefully until it could survive being heard. And as he finally turned back toward the path that led out of the clearing, he knew the silence waiting in Red Hollow would not remain the same once he returned. Because silence, once understood, is never empty again.